Alrighty, this is the Avianca Flight 52 crash, um, presented by yours truly, Garrett Nevels. Uh, so, for a little bit of context on the flight, it was a flight that went from Bogota, Colombia, which is the capital, to New York, and it had an alternate of Boston if it needed to. Um, Some interesting things about it was that the holding time for the flight after it reached New York was 1.5 hours. This was due to traffic and heavy fog. Heavy fog limited the amount of people that could go in and out of the airport, so they definitely weren't much of a priority. This flight had three crew members flying the plane. There was a captain and a first officer and a flight engineer. Um, One of the big things that happened is that the first officer did not relay critical information to ATC. Specifically, when advised, the first officer did not tell ATC that they had an emergency, even though he was prodded to make sure he did. He just said that they were running low on fuel, which ended up being something huge that cost a lot of people their lives. Um, so they ended up allowing the reserve fuel to run out from their alternate to Boston, which was their alternate. They let that fuel run out, and then they also let their reserve fuel run out as well. So, and they did this without notifying ATC. Um, they just didn't make a make a guess, or they didn't make a uh, an effort in order to go to their alternate. They just assumed they were going to land at New York, which ended up being very fatal. Um, so they ended up did they did end up getting their one chance of landing, but they only had one chance of landing, and it was they had a missed approach. So unfortunately, they didn't have enough time to go back for their missed approach and land. And on their second approach, they ended up crashing, and a total of 73 people died, with 85 people being injured. So, like I said, they were flying from Colombia all the way up to New York, and they had a hold of 1.5 hours, which is an incredible amount of time, especially for that length of a flight for that plane to be holding. Although they didn't have any fuel to go to their alternate, they ended up just using that fuel in a hold. So they had to hold 3 times, um, and then on the third time that they were put in a hold, they finally relayed some information. The first officer did to ATC, saying that, hey, we can only hold for 5 more minutes, after the flight engineer prodded the first officer to tell ATC that so they could get priority. Um, ATC asked how long they could hold. They said for only 5 more minutes. Um, this was critical because ATC probably understood it as they only had about 5 more minutes before they needed to make a decision to divert or to not divert. Um, but in reality, they literally only had 5 more minutes of holding time before they had to go in, and they would have just barely made it even then. Um, and the one of the crucial things that happened was that the pilot, the captain, along with the flight engineer, um, urged the first officer to communicate to ATC that they were in an emergency situation, so they would get priority. However, the first officer never uttered those words out of his mouth, so ATC never really treated them as an emergency. Um, Even when they were coming in for they were supposedly a priority approach. They were a priority. They even had other traffic in their way that they had to follow in. It's not like the area was cleared for them to make their approach. It was just um, uh, a mistake that the pilot made that ended up costing them because they never got priority and he never relayed those crucial words, emergency. Um, so for the missed approach, they ended up did having one approach that they were able to conduct, but unfortunately it was a missed approach, um, uh, which I don't know exactly what their minimums were, but they definitely weren't super close to the ground when they executed their missed approach procedure based off a video that I watched. Um, and if it were that dire of an emergency, although they didn't declare it was an emergency, it was an emergency to the people because the pilots even did, I believe they did say that they've only got one shot at this. So they knew that it was going to be a problem if they did do a missed approach. I think they just thought they would be running on fumes. Um, if they did, hopefully that those fumes would be enough for them to make a landing, but unfortunately it wasn't. And so they did their missed approach, and they were like, um, they ended up going further out than they should have, as if they were in an emergency situation. And then on the way back, from the missed approach, they declared that they had one of their engines had flamed out, and then eventually all their engines flamed out because they lost fuel, and they ended up crashing short of the runways. Here are my citations, but some of the things I wanted to talk about was that ATC just doesn't know your situation. They only know as much as information that you give them. You can't infer anything. And the fact that the first officer was hesitant that to use the word emergency, even though they were in like a very critical emergency, shows how I don't think he wanted to burden ATC or whatnot. But I'm not. No one really knows why the first officer didn't use the words emergency when he was contacting or talking with ATC. Um, although ATC could have uh, prodded a little bit more to figure out like exactly how much time they have left based off the flight engineer's calculations, but that didn't happen. Although ATC isn't obligated to do that. Also, another thing was that they were holding for an hour and a half, um, and they didn't even think about their alternate, um, which was crazy. Like that was a fatal mistake that cost them their lives. And ATC should have known that they were coming from Columbia to New York, and then they were circling for an hour and a half. That they should be running low on fuel. I don't know how or why ATC didn't think, hey, this guy's been circling forever. Maybe there were other planes in the way, but maybe some other planes diverted, but these guys decided not to divert, and it ended up costing them their lives. Um, it was just something that could have been avoided, and that 73 people didn't have to die because of. And it was just a very unfortunate accident where communication between ATC and the pilots are critical because they're not up there. They don't know what's going on. So you have to make sure what you're doing is getting relayed across, and you just have to advocate for yourself. And obviously, that first officer was not advocating for them. So that's all I've got, and thank you for watching.